I don't usually talk about this, and to be honest, I've avoided revisiting it for years because every time I think about what happened, my stomach knots up like I'm back there again, in that old crumbling building where I used to live. But since people always ask about the creepiest thing that's ever happened to me, I figured I'd finally put this down in writing, like tearing off an old scab. Back in 2014, I was living alone in a mid-sized city in the Midwest. Nothing fancy, just a beat-up apartment complex that had probably been built in the 60s. The kind of place with peeling wallpaper in the hallways, dim buzzing lights that always flickered, and a landlord who promised repairs but never really delivered. It wasn't the worst place, but it carried this heavy, strange atmosphere, like the walls had soaked up decades of secrets. My unit was on the second floor, apartment 2C, and right above me was apartment 3B. That apartment was the start of everything. I didn't notice much at first. Whoever lived in 3B seemed quiet, and the blinds were always pulled down tight, even during the brightest days. The hallway outside their door always smelled faintly of mildew, like damp wood and something faintly metallic underneath. The weird thing was, despite living there for months, I never once saw my upstairs neighbor in person. Not once. Sometimes I'd hear faint footsteps in the middle of the night, slow and deliberate, pacing back and forth like someone couldn't sleep. Other times, I'd catch faint scraping noises, like heavy furniture being dragged across the floor at 3 a.m. But whenever I went upstairs to knock and ask them to keep it down, the noises would stop instantly. Dead silence. The first real encounter, or at least what I thought was an encounter, happened one night around 1 a.m. I was brushing my teeth when I heard it, 3 slow knocks, right on the ceiling above me. I froze, toothbrush halfway to my mouth. It wasn't random banging, it sounded purposeful, rhythmic. 3 knocks. Pause. Then 3 more. I laughed it off nervously at first, thinking maybe it was just some pipes clanging weirdly. But then I heard it again, this time followed by what sounded like a low, dragging shuffle across the ceiling, directly above my bathroom. I remember standing there, toothpaste foaming in my mouth, staring at the ceiling with this icy chill spreading through my chest. I rinsed quickly, shut the bathroom door, and told myself it was just old building noises. Still, from that night on, I couldn't shake the feeling that whoever was in 3B knew exactly where I was at all times. A few weeks later, I finally asked around about the tenant. The landlord was evasive, just muttered something like, "Yeah, someone lives there, been here a while." Keeps to himself. One of the older ladies in the building, Mrs. Hernandez, lowered her voice when I mentioned 3B. She said, "Don't mess with that one. People don't last long living near him." She wouldn't elaborate, just crossed herself like she was warding off something bad. That unsettled me more than I wanted to admit. Then came the night I actually saw something. I was coming back from a late shift at work, maybe around midnight. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence where even your footsteps sound too loud. As I walked past 3B, I noticed the door was cracked open just a few inches. There was no light inside, just blackness, but I swear I saw an eye staring out through the gap. Not a full face, just one eye, wide and unblinking, glinting faintly in the dim hallway bulb. I froze in place, my keys halfway to my door. For what felt like a full minute, that I just stared, not moving, not blinking. My pulse hammered so hard I could hear it in my ears. I finally fumbled my way into my apartment and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking so badly I dropped my keys twice. I didn't sleep at all that night, just sat awake with every light in the place turned on, listening for footsteps upstairs. Things escalated after that. The noises became more frequent, scraping, dragging, sometimes even muffled whispers I couldn't quite make out. I started having dreams, too, vivid ones where I was standing in that upstairs apartment, surrounded by peeling wallpaper and strange symbols scratched into the walls. In the dreams, there was always someone standing in the corner, too tall, too still, watching me with eyes that seemed to shine in the dark. The dreams got so bad I'd wake up drenched in sweat, convinced someone was standing at the foot of my bed. More than once, I swore I saw the faint outline of a figure moving past my window at night, even though I was on the second floor. The worst night happened in late November. I'd just gotten home, exhausted from a long shift, and collapsed onto my bed fully clothed. Sometime around 3 a.m., I woke up to the sound of knocking again. But this time, it wasn't on the ceiling. It was on my front door. 3 slow knocks. I held my breath, waiting, praying it was just some drunk neighbor at the wrong apartment. The knocks came again, louder. I crept toward the peephole, every step feeling like it echoed through the whole building. When I finally looked through, my heart nearly stopped. It was him. The man from 3B. Except, I shouldn't say man, because what I saw didn't look entirely human. He was tall, gaunt, his skin waxy and pale like candle wax. His eyes were huge, too big for his face, and they reflected the hallway light in a way that made them look like animal eyes. He stood unnaturally still, not swaying, not shifting his weight, just waiting. And the worst part? He was smiling. A slow, stretched grin that didn't reach his eyes. I staggered back from the door, my chest tight, my brain screaming at me to run but my legs refusing to move. Then, in the silence, I heard the faint click of my doorknob turning. He was trying to get in. I grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a metal lamp, and stood frozen, staring at the door, ready to swing. After what felt like hours, the doorknob stilled, and the knocking stopped. I didn't hear footsteps leaving. No sound at all. Just silence pressing in on me like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The next morning, the hallway outside my door looked perfectly normal. No footprints, no sign that anyone had been there. When I went upstairs, heart pounding, I found 3B's door wide open. For the first time, sunlight spilled into the apartment, revealing a place that looked abandoned for years. The floor was covered in dust, the wallpaper hanging in strips, and the smell of rot so strong it made my eyes water. There was no furniture, no signs of life, just one thing that made my blood run cold. On the far wall, scrawled in something dark and dried, were the words, "I see you." I staggered back, heart hammering, nearly tripping over myself as I fled down the stairs. When I demanded answers from the landlord, he looked pale and shaken, swore up and down that 3B had been empty for years. He said no one had signed a lease for that unit since 2009, and that it wasn't even considered livable. I didn't believe him at first, until I saw the records for myself. Sure enough, 3B was listed as vacant. Always had been. To this day, I can still feel that man's eyes on me when I close mine. Sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint knocks on my ceiling, even though I've moved across the country. And I swear, sometimes, when I'm walking home alone, I catch the reflection of 2 big eyes staring at me from darkened windows. When I was 24, I rented a small house in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Columbus, Ohio. At first glance, it seemed like the perfect place, tree-lined streets, kids riding bikes in the summer, neighbors waving politely from their porches. It was the kind of neighborhood people dream of raising families in, a safe and simple corner of America. My house sat on the south side of the street, a modest 2-bedroom with peeling white paint and a sagging porch. Across the street, directly facing my living room window, was a larger 2-story house with faded yellow siding. That house, that was where all the trouble started. When I first moved in, I noticed that the yellow house seemed strangely lifeless. The curtains were always drawn, the grass overgrown, the mailbox overflowing with junk flyers. I asked my landlord about it, and he just shrugged. Some older guy lives there. Keeps to himself. Don't worry about it. At night, though, I couldn't help but notice a dim light flickering in the upstairs window, like a candle flame or an old lamp. I didn't think much of it until I started realizing the light only ever came on when I was in my living room. Almost like whoever was in that house was watching me. The first real incident happened in late spring. I had just gotten home from work, and as I stepped out of my car, I glanced across the street. For the first time, I saw someone. A man was standing in the upstairs window, directly behind the glass. He was tall and thin, his face obscured by the glare of the glass, but I could make out the outline of his head tilted slightly, as if studying me. I froze in place, keys clutched in my hand, before quickly hurrying into my house. When I looked again through my living room blinds, the window was empty. The curtains had been pulled shut. After that, I began noticing him more often. Sometimes in the morning when I left for work, I'd catch a glimpse of him through the window, just barely parting the curtains to peer out. Other times, at night, I'd swear I could see him standing in the yard, motionless, staring straight at my house. Every time I tried to confront him, by walking over or calling out, he would vanish. Neighbors told me conflicting things. Some swore the house was empty, others claimed a reclusive man named Walter lived there but hadn't been seen outside in years. One evening, around midnight, I was watching TV in my living room when I heard it, 3 sharp taps on my front window. I jumped, my heart slamming into my ribs. The blinds were drawn, but I knew someone was standing just inches away on the other side. Slowly, with shaking hands, I lifted a corner of the blind. No one was there. But when I looked across the street, I saw the upstairs window glowing faintly, and behind it, the unmistakable outline of the man. He was closer this time, his pale face pressed against the glass, eyes wide and unblinking. The next morning, I found footprints in the dew on my lawn. Bare footprints. They led from the street to my living room window, then back across the road, disappearing into the tall grass of the yellow house's yard. I called the police, but when they checked the house, they told me it was abandoned. No furniture, no utilities, nothing but dust and cobwebs. They swore no one had lived there in over a decade. I wanted to believe them, but later that night, I saw the light flicker on upstairs again. I started keeping my curtains closed at all times, but it didn't help. I could feel him watching me, pressing in on me from across the street. I began hearing noises in the night, scratching at the siding, faint whispers outside my bedroom window, the crunch of footsteps in my gravel driveway. Once, I woke up to the sound of my front door handle jiggling. When I ran to the door, no one was there, but across the street, the upstairs curtain fluttered shut, like someone had just stepped away. Things reached a breaking point in July. I was sitting in the dark, unable to sleep, when I noticed movement through a crack in my blinds. The man was standing in the middle of the street, directly between our 2 houses. He wasn't moving, wasn't swaying, just standing there, staring at my window. His face was pale and waxy, his eyes too large, glinting in the moonlight. I wanted to call the police again, but my hands wouldn't stop shaking long enough to dial. I just sat there, frozen, until finally, after what felt like an eternity, he turned and slowly walked back toward the yellow house. Except, he didn't go inside. He walked around the side, disappearing into the shadows. The next day, I decided I'd had enough. I went across the street in daylight, determined to prove to myself that the house was empty. The front door was locked tight, so I circled around back. To my surprise, one of the basement windows was cracked open. With a mix of fear and determination, I slid it up and crawled inside. The basement smelled of mildew and rot, the air damp and heavy. I fumbled for my phone flashlight and swept the beam across the room. That's when I saw them. Dozens of photographs. Taped to the walls, scattered across tables, pinned to corkboards. Every single one was of me. Some were from inside my house, me cooking in the kitchen, me sleeping in my bed, me sitting on my couch with the blinds half closed. My knees buckled, and I nearly dropped my phone. These weren't just taken from across the street. They were from inside. My stomach lurched as I backed toward the stairs, desperate to get out. But then I heard it, the slow creak of a floorboard above me. Someone was upstairs. My pulse roared in my ears as I darted toward the basement window, scrambling through it so fast I scraped my arms raw. I bolted across the street and locked myself in my house, every nerve screaming. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat in the corner of my bedroom, clutching a baseball bat, watching the yellow house through a crack in the blinds. Around 2 a.m., the upstairs light came on. The curtain shifted, and there he was again. Smiling. Holding one of the photographs in his hand. The next morning, the yellow house was empty again. Police swore it hadn't been entered, that no one was inside. But I knew the truth. I could feel his eyes on me, even when I left town for good a week later. And here's the part that keeps me awake at night, even years later, when I unpacked at my new apartment in another city, buried in the bottom of one of my moving boxes, I found a single photograph. It was me, sleeping in my new bedroom. Taken the night I moved in. Back in 2017, I moved into a duplex on the outskirts of Milwaukee. It was cheap, which was the only reason I could afford it at the time. The building was old, creaky, and smelled faintly of damp wood, but the landlord promised me it was structurally sound. My half of the duplex was on the left, and the other side was rented by a middle-aged man named Carl. He was quiet, polite enough when we crossed paths, but there was something about him that always unsettled me. His eyes didn't seem to blink enough, and whenever I spoke to him, he would smile a little too widely, like he was rehearsing the expression rather than actually feeling it. The strangest thing about Carl's unit was the basement. The duplex had a shared foundation, but the two basements weren't connected. Mine was empty except for a washer and dryer. His, though, I only ever caught glimpses through the small basement window facing the street, was lit up at odd hours. Sometimes, when I came home late, I'd see a yellow glow seeping through the cracks around his basement door, and if I walked slowly enough past that window, I could swear I saw movement. Shapes. Sometimes tall and lanky, other times hunched. But always shifting. Always pacing. At first, I chalked it up to Carl being a night owl. But the sounds started soon after. Low thumps, dragging noises, sometimes even muffled voices when I was in my basement doing laundry. Once, I heard what sounded like crying, soft, desperate sobs echoing through the concrete walls. I froze, detergent in hand, ears straining, but when I pressed my ear to the wall, the sobs stopped instantly. Silence. I told myself I was imagining things, until one night I came home to find Carl outside, standing in his driveway, staring down at the ground. He didn't move when I pulled in. Didn't wave, didn't acknowledge me. Just kept staring at something near his feet. When I got out of the car, I saw it, a dead rabbit, its body twisted unnaturally, like every bone had been broken. Carl glanced at me then, gave that same too-wide smile, and said, "Cats around here are vicious." But I'd never seen a single stray cat in that neighborhood. Over the next few weeks, I began noticing more animals, birds, squirrels, even a raccoon, left in his yard, all mutilated in strange, precise ways. One night, while taking out the trash, I caught a glimpse through his basement window again. This time, I swear I saw a table covered in something red, with shapes laid out on top. Before I could focus, Carl stepped into view, pulling the curtain shut with that same eerie smile. I should have called the cops right then, but I didn't. I told myself I was overreacting, letting my imagination run wild. That changed the night I woke up to the sound of someone walking in my basement. Slow, heavy footsteps, moving deliberately from one end to the other. I sat frozen in bed, heart pounding, every nerve screaming. I grabbed a flashlight and crept down the stairs, my hands trembling. When I reached the bottom, the basement was empty. Washer, dryer, concrete floor. Nothing else. But the footsteps hadn't been in my head, I knew what I'd heard. The next morning, I noticed something I hadn't before. In the far corner of my basement, behind some old shelving, the wall looked different. A thin crack, running from ceiling to floor, like the concrete had been patched badly. When I pressed my hand against it, I felt a faint draft. And if I leaned in close, I could hear something. A faint scratching, like nails on stone. I barely slept after that. Every night, I'd hear noises, sometimes scratching, sometimes low whispers, sometimes the unmistakable sound of chains rattling. I started avoiding my basement altogether. But one night, while I was lying awake, I heard something that made my blood run cold, the sound of Carl's voice. Clear as day, drifting through the wall. He was chanting something, low and rhythmic, in a language I didn't understand. And underneath his voice was another sound. A voice. Higher pitched. Sobbing. Pleading. The next day, I tried to confront him. I knocked on his door, rehearsing what I'd say, but when he opened it, I froze. He looked different, his skin pale and clammy, dark circles under his eyes, and that smile even wider than usual. Before I could speak, he said, "You've been hearing things, haven't you?" My throat went dry. I muttered something about plumbing noises, but he just chuckled and said, "Basements carry secrets. Best not to listen too closely." Then he shut the door. That night, I couldn't resist. I went down to my basement and pressed my ear against the cracked wall again. This time, I heard something I'll never forget. A voice, weak and hoarse, whispering, "Help me." My heart nearly stopped. I whispered back, "Who are you?" There was a pause, then the voice croaked, "He's coming." I staggered back, flashlight beam shaking wildly, when I heard it, footsteps. On the other side of the wall. Heavy, deliberate. And then, something slammed against the concrete so hard the shelves rattled. I bolted upstairs, locked every door, and sat awake until dawn, gripping a kitchen knife in my shaking hands. 2 days later, Carl's side of the duplex went quiet. No lights, no movement, nothing. The landlord told me he'd moved out suddenly, no forwarding address. I didn't believe it, not for a second. That night, curiosity got the better of me. I went down into my basement one last time, flashlight trembling in my grip. I pressed my ear to the wall. Nothing. Just silence. But then, as I turned to go back upstairs, I noticed something new, a small hole near the base of the cracked wall. And when I crouched down to look, I saw it, an eye. Pale, unblinking, staring straight back at me. When I was 29, I lived for about a year in a small rental house in rural Pennsylvania. It wasn't anything special, just a one-story ranch-style place tucked away on a quiet dead-end street. I'd moved there to save money and get away from the chaos of the city for a while. Most of the neighbors were older couples who kept to themselves, except for one house, the one directly next to mine. It was a gray, weather-worn 2-story home with sagging shutters and ivy crawling up the sides. At first, I thought it was abandoned, because I never saw anyone go in or out. But then, one night, I noticed her. I was closing my blinds when I saw a pale face staring at me from the 2nd-story window of the gray house. A woman, maybe in her 30s, long dark hair hanging loose around her face, her skin so pale it almost glowed in the faint light. She didn't move, didn't wave, just stared straight into my living room. My stomach dropped, and I quickly shut the blinds, telling myself she was just a curious neighbor I hadn't met yet. But when I opened them again a minute later, the window was empty. From that night on, I started seeing her often. Sometimes during the day, peeking out from behind the curtains, other times at night, her face pressed against the glass, unblinking, watching my house. I never saw her step outside. Never saw lights on in the house. Never even saw the curtains move except when she appeared. It was like she existed only to stare out that one window. I mentioned it casually to one of the older neighbors, Mr. Bell, while mowing my lawn. The way his face drained of color told me more than his words ever could. He muttered something like, "You best keep those blinds closed," and shuffled away without another word. That night, I made sure every curtain was shut tight. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that even with the blinds closed, she could somehow see me. The first time it got truly disturbing was a week later. I woke up around 2 a.m. to the sound of tapping on my bedroom window. My heart lurched, and I sat up, straining to listen. Tap. 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 I forced myself to pull back the curtain, but the yard was empty. No one there. Just darkness in the silhouette of the gray house. But when I looked closer, I realized something. The woman wasn't in the 2nd-story window anymore. She was in the downstairs window, directly across from my bedroom, her pale face pressed against the glass. Even from that distance, I could see her lips move. She was mouthing something to me. Over and over. The next morning, I tried to get a closer look at the gray house. The grass was knee-high, the porch sagging, the windows covered in grime. But when I peered through a crack in the front curtains, the house looked empty. No furniture, no pictures, just bare walls and dust. My stomach twisted. Had I imagined her? Was she squatting there? Or worse? That night, I decided to test something. I sat in my living room with the blinds open, staring directly at her window. Hours passed, and nothing. I started to feel ridiculous, until suddenly, there she was. One moment the window was empty, the next her pale face was pressed against it. My breath caught in my throat. Slowly, deliberately, she raised one hand and pointed. Not at me. At something behind me. I spun around so fast I nearly fell, but my living room was empty. When I looked back at her window, she was gone. My heart wouldn't stop racing for hours. After that, things escalated quickly. I'd find my front door unlocked in the morning, even though I was sure I'd bolted it. I'd hear faint footsteps on my porch at night. Once, I came home from work to find muddy footprints leading from the gray house to my back door, and when I unlocked it, a chill swept through me, because everything in my kitchen drawers had been rearranged. I finally called the landlord and demanded answers about the house. He was hesitant, but eventually told me something I'll never forget. The house had been empty for years. The last tenant was a woman named Lorraine, who'd lived there alone after her husband left. Neighbors said she grew more and more reclusive, until one day she simply stopped coming outside. Weeks passed, and when no one had seen her, someone finally called the sheriff. They found her upstairs, in that very same window, dead. She'd been sitting in a chair facing the glass, her body so decayed it stuck to the fabric. The coroner estimated she'd been dead for months before anyone found her. I could barely breathe as he told me. When I asked when this happened, he said it was almost 10 years ago. And since then, no one had lived there. I should have packed up and left right then, but I didn't. I told myself it was just stories, that maybe squatters came and went, maybe kids were messing with me. But then came the night everything snapped. I woke up to the sound of my front door creaking open. My body went rigid. I grabbed the baseball bat from under my bed and crept into the hallway. The door was wide open, the night air pouring in. And on the porch, standing just inside the threshold, was her. The woman from the window. Her skin was gray and sagging, her hair matted, her eyes hollow sockets that seemed to swallow light. She opened her mouth, and a low, rasping moan poured out, like air escaping from a broken pipe. I swung the bat wildly, but she vanished. Just gone. The door slammed shut by itself, rattling the frame. The next morning, I packed everything and left without looking back. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm sitting in my new apartment miles away, I catch myself glancing at the windows across the street. And once, just once, I swear I saw her face again. Pale. Watching. Waiting. Back in 2012, I rented a small one-bedroom apartment in a brick building just outside of Chicago. It was the kind of old, creaky place where the walls were thin and the heat barely worked in winter, but the rent was cheap, and I didn't have many options. My unit was on the 3rd floor. Above me, in the attic apartment, lived someone I only ever knew as the tenant upstairs. I never learned his name. I never even saw him clearly. And to this day, I still don't know if what I experienced was real or if something far darker was at play. At first, I didn't even realize anyone lived above me. The attic windows were always blacked out, no lights ever showed through, and the landlord never mentioned another tenant. But about 2 weeks after I moved in, I started hearing noises. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing across the ceiling late at night. The sound of something heavy dragging across the floor. Sometimes even faint thuds, as if someone had dropped something large. The first time it happened, I assumed someone was moving in. But when it continued night after night, always after midnight, I grew uneasy. One evening, I asked my landlord, Mrs. Klein, about it. She was an older woman, sharp-tongued, the type who prided herself on knowing everything that went on in her building. But when I mentioned the noises upstairs, she went still. Her face drained of color, and she muttered, "No one's supposed to be living up there." When I pressed, she brushed me off, saying the attic wasn't habitable. She told me to keep my door locked at night and not to go poking around. That only made me more curious. Over the next few weeks, the noises grew louder. Sometimes I'd hear faint whispers, though I couldn't make out the words. Once, I woke at 3 a.m. to the sound of scratching directly above my bed, like long fingernails dragging across the floorboards. I lay frozen, staring at the ceiling, praying it would stop. It didn't. The scratching went on for nearly 10 minutes before fading into silence. Then came the smell. A foul, sour odor, like rotting meat mixed with mold, began seeping through the ceiling vents. No matter how much I cleaned, the smell lingered, especially at night. Once, I woke gagging because it was so strong. I complained again to Mrs. Klein, but she snapped that the building was old and the plumbing backed up sometimes. I didn't believe her. The first time I actually saw him was one night when I took out the trash. The back alley was dimly lit, the shadows deep between the dumpsters. As I set the bag down, I caught movement near the fire escape. A tall, gaunt figure was climbing the metal steps, his movements jerky, unnatural. His head turned, and for a brief second, the weak light hit his face. His skin looked waxy, almost translucent, his eyes too wide, reflecting the light like an animal's. My breath caught in my throat. He froze, staring down at me, before vanishing into the attic window above. I barely slept that night. The sounds overhead grew louder, more frantic, footsteps running, something slamming against the floor, muffled voices. At one point, I swore I heard crying. The next morning, I asked some of the other tenants if they'd noticed anything. Most shook their heads quickly, avoiding my eyes. But one older man muttered, "Best to leave it alone. People who ask too many questions don't stay here long." That same week, things escalated. I woke at 2 a.m. to the sound of my apartment door creaking open. My stomach dropped. I always locked it before bed. Slowly, I sat up in the dark, straining to hear. The floorboards in my living room creaked, one slow step at a time. My heart pounded so hard I thought I'd faint. Gathering every ounce of courage, I flicked on my lamp. The footsteps stopped instantly. The apartment was silent. But when I tiptoed to the living room, I found the door standing wide open, the chain lock dangling uselessly. I barely slept for days after that. Then came the night that still haunts me. I woke to the sound of heavy breathing in my bedroom. My eyes flew open, and there he was, standing in the corner of my room. The tenant upstairs. His tall, gaunt frame loomed in the shadows, his face half hidden, but I could see his eyes gleaming in the dark, fixed on me. My body locked up, too terrified to move. Slowly, he took one step forward, then another. His breathing was ragged, unnatural, like he hadn't drawn air in years. I scrambled for the lamp, but when the light flicked on, the corner was empty. He was gone. The next morning, desperate, I went up the fire escape to the attic. The window was cracked open. I hesitated, then climbed inside. The air was damp and foul, the stench of decay overwhelming. The attic was bare except for one thing, a stained mattress in the center of the floor. On the wall above it were dozens of photographs, grainy, black and white shots of the tenants in the building. Some looked decades old. And in every photo, the same figure appeared in the background. Tall. Gaunt. Watching. When I told Mrs. Klein what I'd found, her face went pale. She ordered me never to go up there again. When I pushed, she finally whispered, "That attic's been empty since 1978. But, he's never left." I moved out the next week. But sometimes, in the dead of night, when my new place is silent, I still hear footsteps pacing above me. When I first bought my house in 2017, I thought I'd lucked out. It was a cozy little two-story in a quiet suburban neighborhood just outside of Portland, Oregon. The kind of street where everyone had trimmed lawns, mailboxes painted to match their shutters, and wind chimes that jingled in the summer breeze. It seemed like the perfect place to settle down after years of renting cramped apartments. The house next door belonged to an elderly woman named Mrs. Weaver. I only saw her a few times in those first weeks. She kept to herself, rarely left the house, and always wore a wide-brimmed hat that shaded her face. But every night, just as the sun went down, I would see her standing in her garden. She never watered plants or pulled weeds. She just stood there, perfectly still, watching. At first, I chalked it up to eccentricity. Lots of older folks had strange habits. But there was something about the way she stood, her posture too stiff, her head always tilted just slightly toward my house, that made me uneasy. It felt less like a neighbor tending her yard and more like a sentinel keeping watch. One night, around midnight, I woke to the sound of soft humming outside my bedroom window. When I peeked through the blinds, I nearly jumped out of my skin. Mrs. Weaver was standing in the middle of her garden again, but this time, her head was tilted back, her mouth moving, her body swaying ever so slightly. The humming was low and tuneless, almost like a chant. I told myself she was just talking to herself, maybe sleepwalking. Still, I pulled the curtains shut and left the light on until dawn. Over the next few weeks, the sightings grew stranger. Sometimes, I'd catch her in the morning, still standing there in the exact same spot as the night before, as if she hadn't moved all night. Other times, I'd notice that she was holding something in her hands, what looked like a bundle of twigs or maybe bones tied together with twine. The humming became more frequent, too, drifting across the fence and into my house whenever I left the windows open. Finally, my curiosity got the better of me. I decided to introduce myself properly. One afternoon, I walked over while she was crouched by a patch of dead roses. "Hi," I said, forcing cheer into my voice. "I'm your new neighbor. Thought I'd come say hello." She didn't look up. She just kept fiddling with the soil, her hat shading her face completely. After a long silence, she finally muttered, "You shouldn't have moved here." The words were so blunt, so cold, that I didn't know how to respond. I laughed nervously and asked if she needed help with her garden. That's when she finally lifted her head. Her skin was pale, almost gray, her lips thin and cracked. But it was her eyes that froze me, milky white, cloudy, as if she were blind. And yet, I felt her gaze lock onto me with terrifying precision. That night, I dreamed of her garden. In the dream, the soil bubbled like boiling water, and pale, skeletal hands clawed their way up from beneath the earth. Mrs. Weaver stood above them, humming, her hands raised like a conductor guiding an orchestra. When I woke, drenched in sweat, the humming was still in my ears. But this time, it wasn't a dream. It was coming from outside my window. I nearly called the police, but what would I even say? My neighbor was humming in her garden. Instead, I bought blackout curtains and tried to ignore it. Then, one evening, I came home from work to find something on my porch. A small bundle wrapped in burlap and tied with twine. When I opened it, my stomach lurched. Inside were bird bones, arranged carefully in the shape of a human figure. There was no note, no explanation, just the bone doll staring up at me. The next day, I confronted her. I held the bundle out and demanded, "Did you leave this on my porch?" She didn't answer. She just smiled, a thin, knowing smile that made my skin crawl, and turned back to her garden. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that smile. Around 3 a.m., I heard rustling outside. Against my better judgment, I looked out the window. My breath caught in my throat. Mrs. Weaver wasn't in her garden. She was in mine. She stood motionless by my fence, her pale face tilted up toward my window. In one hand, she held another bone figure. In the other, a knife that glinted in the moonlight. I yanked the curtains shut and sat awake until dawn. The next morning, I called the police. When they came, Mrs. Weaver's yard was empty. No bone figures, no signs of her night visits. The officers assured me she was probably just a lonely old lady and told me to install cameras if I was concerned. But that evening, when I checked her yard, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Where her garden used to be, the soil had been dug up completely, like dozens of graves side by side. In each hole sat a bone figure, carefully placed, all facing my house. That was the night I decided to leave. I packed what I could and stayed in a motel across town. 2 days later, when I returned for the rest of my things, Mrs. Weaver's house was empty. The windows boarded up. The garden gone, replaced by a patch of scorched earth. I asked around the neighborhood, but no one admitted to knowing much about her. Finally, an older man down the street told me in a hushed voice, "That house has been abandoned for 20 years. Hasn't been a Mrs. Weaver there since the 90s. But I know what I saw. And sometimes, late at night, I still hear that low, tuneless humming drifting through my dreams." Back in 2014, I moved into a duplex on the outskirts of Denver. It wasn't much, just a narrow, 2-story place with faded siding and a cracked driveway, but it was affordable, and I liked the idea of living somewhere quiet. The unit next to mine was supposed to be occupied by a middle-aged man named Paul, though I never saw him when I first moved in. His blinds were always drawn, his lights off, and the mailbox stuffed to the brim with unopened letters. At first, I thought maybe he traveled for work. But then, late at night, I started hearing noises. Not the usual sounds of a neighbor's TV or footsteps, but odd, unsettling noises, soft knocking, dragging sounds, and occasionally what I swore was whispering through the paper-thin walls. I told myself it was just an old building settling, but there was something deliberate about the timing. The knocks always came after midnight. The whispers only when I lay down to sleep. One night, around 2 a.m., I was woken by a loud crash from Paul's side of the duplex. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened. For a long time, there was silence. Then came the unmistakable sound of footsteps pacing slowly back and forth. I pressed my ear against the wall. The steps stopped immediately. And then, so close it felt like the voice was right next to my ear, I heard someone whisper, "Don't look." I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside and knocked on Paul's door. No answer. I tried again later that evening, still nothing. But just as I turned to leave, I heard movement inside. The blinds shifted, ever so slightly, as if someone was peeking out. "Paul?" I called. Silence. The blinds dropped back into place, and the house went still. Over the following weeks, things only got stranger. I began waking up to find objects in my house moved. A chair slightly out of place. My keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook. Once, I came home from work to find my front door unlocked. I could have sworn I'd locked it that morning. Nothing was missing, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been inside. I tried to convince myself it was paranoia, until the night I heard someone breathing in my living room. I'd fallen asleep on the couch with the TV on low. Around 1 a.m., I woke to the sound of slow, heavy breathing. At first, I thought it was coming from the show playing, but when I muted the TV, the sound continued. My skin prickled. I sat frozen, straining to hear. The breathing grew louder, ragged, as if whoever it was standing just a few feet away. I flicked on the lamp. The room was empty. The next morning, I marched straight to Mrs. Green, the elderly woman who owned the duplex and lived down the street. I asked her point blank about Paul. She grew pale and avoided my eyes. Finally, she muttered, "Paul hasn't lived there in years." My stomach dropped. "Then who?" I started, but she cut me off, shaking her head. "Don't ask questions. Just keep your doors locked." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what she'd said. Around midnight, I heard the familiar dragging sound from the other side of the wall. My curiosity finally outweighed my fear. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Paul's windows were dark, the blinds drawn. I circled to the back of the house, where there was a small basement window, half covered with dirt and weeds. I crouched down and shone the flashlight inside. For a moment, all I saw was darkness. Then, something pale flashed in the beam, an eye. Wide, unblinking, staring straight at me. I stumbled back, heart slamming in my chest. The face pressed closer against the glass. Thin. hollow-cheeked. A mouth stretched into a too-wide grin. I bolted back inside and locked every door and window. For hours, I sat in the dark, clutching a kitchen knife, jumping at every creak. Eventually, exhaustion pulled me under. When I woke the next morning, there was a note taped to my door. No envelope, no signature. Just 4 words scrawled in shaky handwriting: "You looked too late." Terrified, I begged Mrs. Green to let me break my lease. At first, she refused, insisting contracts were contracts. But when I showed her the note, her face went pale. She nodded once and whispered, "Go. Tonight. Don't come back." I moved out within 24 hours. But the story didn't end there. A few months later, I heard from a former coworker who still lived in the neighborhood. He told me the duplex had been boarded up. When I asked why, he hesitated, then said, "They found something in the basement. A body. Or, maybe more than one." I pressed him for details, but he wouldn't say another word. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I still hear that whisper against my ear, "Don't look." I grew up in a small town in Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else, and nothing ever seemed out of the ordinary. Our street was quiet, lined with identical houses and neat yards. But across from my family's home stood a place everyone avoided, the Miller house. When I was a kid, the Millers were just names whispered at the bus stop. Rumor had it they'd all disappeared one night in the early 90s, parents, kids, even their dog. The house sat empty for decades after, its windows black, the paint peeling, the lawn wild. Parents warned their kids to stay away, and even as adults, the neighbors avoided looking at it for too long. But when I was 24, after I'd come back from college to live with my folks for a while, I started noticing strange things. The first time was late one night when I pulled into the driveway. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a light flicker in the upstairs window of the Miller house. It was faint, like a candle. I blinked, and it was gone. A few nights later, I heard it, faint piano music drifting through the still night air. The Miller house had a grand piano in the living room. I remembered peeking through the window as a kid. The music was soft, deliberate, like someone pressing one key at a time. When I told my parents, they just shook their heads and said I must have been imagining things. But the music came back, night after night, always between midnight and 2 a.m. Curiosity got the better of me. I started sitting by my bedroom window after midnight, watching the house. Sometimes I saw shadows moving across the upstairs curtains. Once, I even swore I saw a figure, a woman, pale and thin, standing just inside the window, staring out at the street. One evening, I decided to investigate. Armed with nothing more than a flashlight and my phone, I crossed the street and slipped into the overgrown yard. The house loomed above me, its shutters hanging loose, the front door warped with age. The air smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like rust, or blood. I circled around to the back, where a broken basement window gaped open. Against my better judgment, I crawled inside. The air was damp and heavy, the floor thick with dust. My flashlight beam swept across the basement, illuminating boxes, broken furniture, and, most unsettling, rows of small jars lining the shelves. Inside each jar floated something pale and misshapen. I leaned closer and nearly gagged. They were teeth. Human teeth. Dozens of jars filled with them. A floorboard creaked above me. I froze, heart hammering. Another creak, followed by slow, deliberate footsteps. Someone was upstairs. I crept toward the basement stairs, each step screaming in my ears. When I reached the top, I pushed the door open a crack and peered inside. The living room looked exactly as I remembered, dusty furniture, the grand piano, wallpaper peeling in long strips. But there was something new, photographs covering the walls. Hundreds of them. I stepped inside, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The photos were all of the same thing, the street outside. My neighbors' houses. My own house. Some were recent, printed on glossy paper. Others were old and yellowed, decades in age. My throat tightened when I spotted one photo in particular, me, sitting at my bedroom window just a few nights earlier, staring across at the Miller house. The piano music started again. Slow, deliberate notes echoing through the empty air. My blood ran cold. The sound was coming from upstairs. I should have left right then. But something compelled me forward. I climbed the staircase, each creak of the wood loud as thunder. At the top, the hallway stretched into darkness. The piano music grew louder, though when I glanced into the living room, the piano keys weren't moving. The sound was coming from somewhere else. I followed it to a door at the end of the hall. My hand shook as I turned the knob. Inside was a bedroom. The walls were lined with more photographs, this time of people. Neighbors, strangers, children playing in their yards. All with their eyes scratched out. And sitting in the corner was the woman I'd seen in the window. Her skin was deathly pale, her hair long and stringy. She rocked back and forth, humming softly. When my light fell on her, she lifted her head. Her eyes were gone, just empty sockets staring straight at me. I stumbled back, nearly tripping over something on the floor. When I shone the light down, my stomach dropped. It was another jar, but this one didn't hold teeth. It held two pale, cloudy eyeballs floating in murky liquid. The woman's mouth twisted into a grin. "They watch for me," she whispered. Her voice was dry, cracked, like paper tearing. "They always watch." I bolted down the stairs, through the living room, and out the front door, not daring to look back. I didn't stop running until I was inside my own house with every lock secured. The next morning, I went back with my father. But when we entered the Miller house, everything was gone. No photographs, no jars, no woman. Just empty rooms filled with dust. My dad told me I must have been dreaming, but I knew better. 2 weeks later, a new family moved into the Miller house. They lasted less than a month. I never asked why they left in such a hurry. But sometimes, late at night, when the street is still and the world is asleep, I hear faint piano notes drifting across from the house across the street. And I swear I see a pale face watching from the upstairs window, except now, it isn't hers. It looks just like mine. In 2019, after a bad breakup, I moved into a modest townhouse complex in Phoenix, Arizona. The units were all the same, brown stucco walls, identical front porches, postage stamp yards. It wasn't glamorous, but it was quiet, and quiet was all I wanted. The first week there, I noticed the couple who lived next door. At first glance, they seemed perfectly ordinary. Mid-30s, dressed neatly, always together. I'd see them unloading groceries, walking to their car, or sitting on their porch in the evenings. But something about them unsettled me. They never smiled. Never waved. They just watched. If I happened to glance over, both their heads would turn at the same time, their eyes locking on me like predators scenting prey. I brushed it off as paranoia. Maybe they were just socially awkward. But the strangeness escalated quickly. One night, around midnight, I heard faint tapping on the shared wall between our units. At first, I thought it was pipes or the wind. But the tapping became rhythmic, deliberate, 3 taps, pause, 3 taps, pause. I pounded on the wall, shouting for them to cut it out. The tapping stopped immediately. But a moment later, from outside my bedroom window, I heard it again, 3 taps on the glass. I didn't sleep that night. Over the next few days, I noticed little things out of place in my home. A mug in the wrong cabinet. My phone charger moved. Once, I found my bedroom window unlatched, though I hadn't opened it since moving in. I started to wonder if the couple had a spare key. One evening, I came home from work to find a package on my porch. No return address. Inside was a framed photograph. At first, I didn't recognize it. Then my blood ran cold. It was my bedroom, taken from inside the room. I could see my bed, my dresser, even the half-drunk glass of water I'd left on the nightstand. I marched next door and banged on their door until my fists ached. Finally, it opened a crack. The woman peered out, her face expressionless. "Can I help you?" she asked in a flat, monotone voice. I held up the photo, demanding an explanation. She looked at it, then at me, and said softly, "We just wanted you to feel at home." Then she shut the door. That night, I dreamed I was standing in a living room. The walls were lined with photographs, dozens of them. All of me. Sleeping, eating, reading, showering. Every moment of my private life captured and displayed. In the dream, the couple stood behind me, whispering in unison, "You belong to us now." When I woke, drenched in sweat, I swore I heard the whispering still echoing through the walls. Desperate, I confided in my landlord. He looked uncomfortable and said, "There hasn't been a couple in that unit for years. It's been vacant since 2015. My stomach dropped. "That's impossible," I said. "I see them every day." But he just shook his head and told me I must be mistaken. That night, I sat by the window, waiting. Around midnight, the porch light next door flicked on. The couple stepped outside, standing perfectly still in the yellow glow. Slowly, they turned their heads toward me, as if they knew I was watching. The man raised his hand, and in it, he held another photograph. Even from across the yard, I recognized it. It was me, sitting by the window in that exact moment. I stumbled back, my chest tightening. When I looked again, the porch was empty. No couple. No light. Just darkness. I wanted to call the police, but what could I say? My non-existent neighbors were taking photos of me. Instead, I boarded up my windows and slept with the lights on. 2 weeks later, I moved out. I didn't even tell my landlord, I just left the keys on the counter and drove away. But a few nights later, staying at a friend's place, I got a text from an unknown number. It was a picture. Grainy, but unmistakable. Me, sleeping on the couch in my friend's living room. The caption read, "We're still next door." In 2015, I rented a small ground-floor apartment in an old 3-story house that had been converted into units. My place was on the bottom, with a separate entrance in the back. Across the narrow alley was another old house that had clearly seen better days, peeling paint, cracked shutters, a sagging porch. I never saw much activity there, just the occasional flicker of light in the basement windows. From the first week, I noticed something strange. In the back of my apartment, there was a locked door that my landlord said led to the shared basement. He told me not to worry about it, it was just for utilities, and no tenant needed to go down there. But at night, I'd hear noises from the other side. Scraping, dragging, faint thuds. Sometimes, what sounded like someone whispering directly against the wood. I tried to convince myself it was just pipes, or maybe rats. But one night, as I lay in bed, I heard 3 slow knocks from behind that basement door. Perfectly spaced, deliberate. My blood turned cold. I didn't move a muscle, just waited, heart hammering. A minute later, 3 more knocks, louder this time. The next morning, I called the landlord again. He insisted no one had access but him, and the basement was empty. When I pressed him, his tone shifted. "Don't go down there," he said firmly. "No matter what you hear." That warning only made things worse. The noises escalated. Footsteps pacing in the night. A dragging sound that lasted for hours. Once, I swore I heard someone laughing softly, low and breathy, like it was meant only for me to hear. Then, about 2 weeks in, I came home from work to find the basement door slightly ajar. My stomach lurched. The landlord always kept it locked. The air that drifted out was damp and foul, carrying a metallic tang that made me gag. Against my better judgment, I leaned closer. The darkness beyond was thick, impenetrable. And from inside, I heard breathing. Slow. Heavy. Too close. I slammed the door shut and shoved a chair against it. That night, I couldn't sleep. Around 3 a.m., I woke to the sound of the chair scraping across the floor. I bolted upright to see the basement door wide open. Darkness gaped beyond. My flashlight shook in my hand as I crept closer. The air was freezing, damp. I shined the beam down the steps. A figure stood halfway up the stairs. Pale, gaunt, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its eyes gleamed in the light, too wide, too bright. It smiled, showing teeth that were jagged and too many in number. My breath hitched, and I stumbled back. The figure didn't move, just stood there, grinning, as if waiting. The next thing I remember, it was morning. I woke on the floor, the basement door shut tight again. I told myself it had to be a nightmare. But when I looked at my arm, I found long, thin scratches running down from my shoulder to my wrist. I demanded answers from my landlord. His face went pale when I described what I'd seen. Finally, in a low voice, he told me the truth. That house across the alley, years ago, the man who lived there, he wasn't right. He'd break into basements, dig tunnels, connect houses underground. He said he wanted to live inside people's walls. When the police finally went in, they found rooms dug beneath half the block. He'd been keeping things down there. He swallowed hard. We sealed everything, but sometimes, the walls don't keep. I moved out within a week, leaving most of my belongings behind. But even now, in my new place, I sometimes wake to faint knocks on the wall. 3 knocks. Always 3. And last month, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. In the closet of my new bedroom, behind the coats and boxes, there's a small wooden door I swear wasn't there before. I haven't opened it yet. I grew up in a quiet suburb in Pennsylvania, the kind of neighborhood where every lawn was trimmed and every neighbor knew your name. For most of my life, I never thought of it as anything but safe. That changed the summer I turned 22, when I moved back into my childhood home to save money after college. Our house sat across from another 2-story colonial that had been empty for years. It belonged to an old man named Mr. Cooley, who was rumored to have passed away alone inside. The bank kept the property, but no one ever bought it. The windows were always shuttered, the porch sagged with rot, and weeds devoured the once proud garden. The first week back, I was unpacking boxes in my upstairs bedroom when I noticed something odd. Across the street, in one of the second-floor windows of Cooley's house, the curtain twitched. Not just once, several times, as if someone was standing there, peeking out. I froze. That house was supposed to be abandoned. I convinced myself it was a trick of the wind, maybe birds or squirrels nesting. But that night, as I sat at my desk, I glanced up and saw it again. The curtain shifting, then stillness. For a moment, I swore I saw a face, a pale, long face with dark, sunken eyes, peering back at me. I told my parents, but they brushed it off. Kids break in there all the time, my dad said. Probably some teenagers daring each other. But this felt different. Whoever I saw wasn't moving around, wasn't exploring. They were watching. Always watching. As days passed, the sightings grew more frequent. Every time I looked out my window, no matter the hour, that same window across the street would have a faint figure behind the curtain. Some nights, I would wake up at 3 a.m. with the distinct sense of being observed. I'd glance outside, and sure enough, 2 eyes would glint faintly in the dark. Things escalated when I began finding things on our porch. A dead bird, its neck twisted. A handful of dirt arranged in a small mound, like a grave. Once, an old-fashioned key, rusted and heavy. I had no idea where it came from, or what it unlocked. My parents dismissed it all as pranks, but the pit in my stomach told me otherwise. One evening, I decided to test the theory. I waited until I saw the curtain twitch. Then I turned off all the lights in my room, slipped downstairs, and quietly stepped outside. The night air was heavy, cicadas buzzing. The street was empty, silent. I crept across the road, my heart pounding. Up close, Cooley's house was worse than I imagined, boards warped, paint flaking like diseased skin. But the window was there, faintly lit from within. Someone was inside. I forced myself onto the porch, each step creaking like it would collapse beneath me. I pressed my ear against the door. At first, nothing. Then, scraping. Like fingernails dragging across wood. I stumbled back, trembling. And then, through the crack in the curtains, a face appeared. Inches away. Gaunt, gray skin stretched tight over bone. Lips cracked, pulled back in what could only be described as a grin. Its eyes locked on mine, wide and unblinking. I bolted back across the street, not daring to look back until I slammed my own door shut. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the house sounded like footsteps. Around 2 a.m., I heard tapping at my window. Slow. Rhythmic. I pulled back the curtain and nearly screamed. The figure from across the street was outside my second-story window. Its hands were pressed to the glass, its face inches from mine, those lifeless eyes staring through me. But here's the thing, my room was on the second floor. There was no balcony, no ledge. Nothing for it to stand on. I stumbled back, tripping over my chair. By the time I scrambled up, the figure was gone. The next morning, I begged my parents to let us move. They laughed nervously, but I could see unease creeping into their eyes. My dad finally admitted he had seen something too, shadows moving across that window at night. My mom confessed she heard knocking sounds when she was alone, always coming from the walls facing the street. We called the police, who did a walkthrough of Cooley's property. They came out pale and tight-lipped, refusing to say much. Just that the house was unfit for trespassers. But that night, the face returned to the window. Not in Cooley's house, no. This time, it was in ours. I woke around midnight, sensing movement. And there it was, pressed against the inside of my closet door mirror. Not outside. Not across the street. Inside my room. The pale figure, smiling wider than humanly possible, its teeth like jagged needles. I screamed, flipping on the light, only to find the mirror empty. I tried to convince myself it was hallucination from lack of sleep. Until the following morning, when my mom found the rusted key I'd left downstairs now sitting on her pillow. That was when I knew it wasn't confined to that house. Whatever had lived in Cooley's windows had crossed over. And it wasn't just watching anymore, it was inside, moving closer every night. I don't live there anymore. We sold the house within the year, but I'll never forget the last night I spent in that room. As I was packing, I glanced out the window one final time. Across the street, Cooley's house sat empty and lifeless, curtains still. But in my own reflection in the glass, there was another face just over my shoulder. Smiling. I never thought I'd be afraid of my own neighborhood. I'd grown up in a small cul-de-sac in Ohio, the kind of place where kids played kickball in the street and everyone waved when you drove by. But when I moved back into my parents' old house after they retired, I realized time had changed things. Some neighbors had died, some had moved, and new families had taken their place. The strangest new face belonged to the man who lived directly next door. Nobody knew his name. He never introduced himself, never spoke a word, not even a casual wave. He kept to himself, his blinds always drawn, his yard overgrown. He drove an old black sedan with no license plates, and the only time I ever saw him outside was at night, when he'd stand silently on his porch, smoking, staring across the street as if he was waiting for something. At first, I tried to shrug it off. Every neighborhood has a recluse, right? But I started to notice things that didn't make sense. His lights were always off, except for one flickering bulb in the upstairs window. Packages sat on his doorstep for weeks, untouched. Yet somehow, every night at exactly 2:13 a.m., I would hear footsteps in my backyard, the crunch of boots on gravel, the soft scrape against the side of my house. The first time it happened, I thought it was just an animal. But when I pulled back my curtain, I saw him, my neighbor, standing in the middle of my yard. Not moving, not doing anything, just staring up at my window. He stood there for hours. When the sun began to rise, he turned and walked silently back to his house. I didn't sleep the next night, waiting to see if it would happen again. And it did. Always at 2:13. Always in the same spot, staring. I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I asked around the neighborhood, but no one else had seen him. In fact, most people looked confused when I described him. A couple even swore the house had been empty for years. That's when I started keeping notes. Dates, times, what I saw. For weeks, the pattern held, 2:13 a.m., footsteps, staring. But then things escalated. I began finding muddy boot prints on my porch, leading straight up to my back door. My doorknob would rattle in the middle of the night. Once, I woke to find the door actually unlocked, even though I was certain I had bolted it before bed. Terrified, I installed a motion camera facing the yard. The next morning, I checked the footage. At 2:13, the floodlight snapped on, illuminating the figure of my neighbor. But the video froze, glitched, and then went black for exactly 6 minutes. When it came back, the yard was empty. I replayed it a dozen times, but the same thing happened. Like the camera itself refused to show me what he did during those minutes. I finally called the police. They checked the house next door. When they came back, they told me something that made my blood run cold. "Ma'am, there's no one living in that house. It's been abandoned since 2008. I laughed nervously, insisting I'd seen the man countless times, then he stood in my yard every night. The officers exchanged a look I couldn't read. One of them pulled me aside. "Whatever you think you're seeing, just stay inside. Don't engage. Lock your doors." And then they left. That night, 2:13 came again. I didn't even bother checking the window, I already knew he was out there. But this time, I heard something new. Whispering. Low, guttural, words I couldn't understand. The sound pressed against the walls, seeping through the cracks, circling the house like a predator. The whispers stopped abruptly, and then, silence. A silence so deep I could hear my own heartbeat. Slowly, against every instinct, I glanced out the window. He wasn't in the yard. He was standing inside my fence. I staggered back, tripping over my chair. My phone slipped from my hand. When I looked again, he was gone. But in the reflection of the glass, I saw him standing behind me. I screamed, spinning around, but the room was empty. The only proof that anything had happened was the faint smell of smoke, like burnt tobacco, hanging in the air. After that, I refused to stay another night. I packed a bag and drove to a motel across town. But even there, sleep didn't come easy. Around 2:13 a.m., the fire alarm in the building went off. Guests stumbled into the hallways, panicked. I pushed outside with them, coughing from the smoke, and froze. Across the parking lot, leaning against his black sedan, was my neighbor. Smiling. Watching. He lifted his cigarette to his lips, the ember glowing red in the dark. And then, just as suddenly, he was gone. I checked out the next morning and never returned to that house. My family sold it within the year. But sometimes, in new cities, in new apartments, when I least expect it, I still hear it, the crunch of boots at 2:13 a.m. outside my window. And last night, as I scrolled through the photos on my phone, I found something I didn't remember taking. A picture of me, asleep in bed. The timestamp? 2:13 a.m. If that house has been abandoned for years, then who is the man I keep seeing outside every place I move?